Okay, 7:30. Right, okay. Good evening, everybody. I thought I'd be getting used to speaking to a computer screen by now, but it's still quite unusual to sort of see that there are over 40 people listening and I can't see any of you. But welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for logging in. My name's Nerys Wright. I work for AHDB and Lamb. I'm a knowledge exchange manager and I cover the South East and the Eastern regions. And if many of you know me, you'll know I'm quite passionate about my sheep work. So today's topic, weaning this year for profit next year, is quite timely, and also we'll be focusing on sheep production. So Joseph, are you going to just cover through the question and answer session and how that works for us, please, my colleague Joseph?
Yeah. So yeah, my name is Joseph Keating. You'll be glad to know you won't have to look at me for too much, hopefully tonight. So what we'll do is, just to make sure, again, to test everyone knows how the technology works, if Nerys clicks onto the next slide, we'll just show you the question function. So the point of these conversations is that you have plenty of opportunity to ask questions along the way. So my role tonight is I'll pop up through the hour or so, just with your questions as they come in. So make sure you do ask plenty of questions. So if you see how Nerys is showing there, for those of you who may be not familiar, you press that little arrow, that little orange arrow button, and that'll pop out the box. And then under the tab for questions, you just type in your question and press send. So it's fairly straightforward, hopefully. So make sure, ask plenty. We'll get through as much as we can. Anything we don't get through tonight, we will try and answer as much as we can and then follow up with the email to the recording later. So we'll try our best. And then just as a starter, we do have one question just to make sure it's working. If I click on, so yes, so here's a nice simple question for you, and you can just type in A, B, C, or D. So how much rain had you had this week? Nothing worth mentioning, not enough, a bit, but more needed, or had enough. So if you just want to type in your answers, and I think they're already starting to come through, so that's good.
Yeah. Someone typing really fast the first answer.
There you go. We should offer a prize for these things. So yeah, that's it for me for now. I'll hand back over to you, Nerys, and yeah, I'll turn off my camera for now, but I'll pop back up a few minutes later when we have a few questions. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Joseph. Yeah, so it's not just going to be listening to me this evening, ladies and gentlemen. We have got Matt Blyth joining us. Matt, if you introduce yourself, many of you will probably know you when you used to work as flock manager over at Diddling, but if you just give a bit of introduction to yourself for us, please.
Yeah, I'm Matthew Blyth. Most people know I used to manage Diddling Farms for 15 years, and our main thing was sheep. We rented arable out as well, but some major changes in the farm I got made redundant. So I'm now out specialising in helping other farmers collect data and use it to help drive their businesses forward, which we were doing a lot of at Diddling, like the KPI project. So that's what I'm up to these days.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't know if any of you have listened to any of these talks before, but the very simplistic way I think of it is that you're going to listen to me and Matt have a chat, and then you get the opportunity to ask some questions as that proceeds over time. And Joseph is there to make sure that we don't completely go off course and literally end up having a random chat and not take any notice of any of the questions. So please do ask questions as the discussions are going. If your question doesn't get asked immediately, bear with us, because Joseph knows what our key sort of 4 topics that we would like to cover this evening. So it might be that he knows it's coming and he's going to save your question until later on. So do bear with us. So it's probably just worth mentioning then how Matt and I started working together. Matt, it's been quite a few years now. So we started when I joined AHDB in 2013, a project called the KPI. Yes, it is long ago as that. Yeah. Feels a lot less. We started on this project called KPI, Sheep Performance Indicators, and Matt at Diddling was one of the 3 farms who took part in that project. Now, this project, as I say, started in 2013. Many of you will have heard me talk about this project before, and you're probably wondering, has she not finished that yet? So the results are coming out of that project. They've been coming out sort of year by year ever since we started it, but I'm about to submit my thesis later this year. So you will be sick of hearing the results from this project over the next 2 or 3 years. But I thought it would just be worth starting by just sort of highlighting this is the data that was collected on the farms. And quite often I will say we collected. And today it does mean we, because it means me and Matt, but I didn't collect any of this data. This was very much done by the farmer. So we collected body condition score and weaning, body condition score and live weight information from all of the breeding ewes on 3 flocks throughout England. We did it at weaning, mating, scanning, with just BCS at lambing, no live weight, and then again 8 weeks post lambing, and the cycle started again at weaning. Those lambs were tagged at birth and linked to the mothers, and then we weighed those lambs at 8 weeks and we weighed them at weaning, and then we were able to link their performance back to individual sheep. It's the first time we've ever been able to do a project of that sort, linking back to individual ewe performance as well, rather than just looking at sort of flock averages. So Matt, I don't know if you want to, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to say, no, it was the first time it's ever done. We had to go to all the software manufacturers and get them to help us, because nobody had ever tried to do anything like this before. It was one hell of an ask from AHDB and everybody that was involved to start with, just to bring it all together. You know, now we look at it and go, oh, this is easy, but that first year, trying to bring it all together was a nightmare.
I think both Leslie and I have got grey hairs. So Leslie Stubbings and Liz Jennifer were massively involved in this project as well. And the first year, because I'm sure many of you can empathise with this, we can collect a lot of data as an industry, and we just felt it was going into a big black hole. Extracting it out of that software was the biggest task that we had to begin with, and then sort of linking it back to the sheep and trying to build a spreadsheet. But now I feel quite confident in my Excel skills. There's more to learn. There's always more to learn, but I feel like I've learned a lot of Excel skills over that time. So Matt, how did you find collecting all that data?
You know, it was half the reason the project started. We were doing most of it anyway, and not quite understanding how to join the piece of the puzzle together. And that's where it all came from, and that's where the project started from. But the biggest problem we had was the lambing time data. As everybody knows, it's a busy time anyway to collect data, and that was the only difficult time. The rest of it made so much sense and was, I wouldn't say easy to collect, but it just seemed to become easier and easier as we got into the routine of doing it.
Yeah, okay, well that's good to hear, because it did seem to get that every year I asked for more as well. So I do have to appreciate everything. You know, we looked at the year's analysis, and at the end of every year it was like, oh, if we could just have this, and if we could just have this, and that's the thing, you always want more. But the reason we're talking about this project today is the fact that well, I've been analysing more of the data in different ways over the last sort of 6 months to a year, and it's become really quite interesting to see the impact that we are seeing ewe body condition score and ewe live weight at weaning having on the performance of the flock in the subsequent year. And so we collected data over 3.5 production years. So we started at scanning of 1 year and then 3 full years thereafter. And I've just done an analysis where I've just merged all the farms and all of the years together, and it's been coming out as statistically significant in terms of weaning BCS and live weight at BCS on litter size at scanning for the next year. So it's about sort of trying to get that discussion going now about, you know, we're having a difficult year. I mean, I thought that rain question was quite timely. In terms of we are struggling in lots of part of the country for grass. At what point do we start realising, do you know, what's happening now is actually going to impact next year's scanning already, what is going to happen? So that's why we wanted to talk about this subject now, really. It's not just a case of, well, let's just look at tupping, see what the impacts are then and just do the best we've got. There are things that we could possibly do now that we could look at to try and impact or reduce that impact on scanning next year. So
I think that's one of the biggest things to come out of the project, is that we've discovered that things happen a lot earlier than what we ever believed, and I think that's one of the big take-home messages. And few of us guessed it, but now we've got the proof to back it up.
Yeah, and I think the beauty of repeating data on the same farm over a number of years is that you can just say it wasn't on 1 year, because the first year was 2013 lambing, and I can't remember why, but that was a difficult year. And we thought, well, let's repeat it for several years and see if we see the trends coming out again, and we absolutely are. And the other reason why I thought this is quite a timely subject to discuss was as another sort of section of my thesis is a social science survey, and I saw some of the people on the list today, and many of you will have received the email from me to ask you, please fill in this questionnaire, and 326 of you did complete it. Thank you very much. And it was just quite interesting. I asked, out of all those sort of key times of year, how important did farmers consider ewe condition to be at all the key points? So Matt, I haven't told you this data, but I don't know if people would want to sort of write the answers in the box either. What do you think farmers perceive the most important time of year to be out of those 5, and which perceived it to be the least important?
Well, I would guess they would say, because it's how we've been taught at college and etc., is mating's the most important time.
Yeah.
The least important time, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm guessing that they probably say around the 8-week point.
Interesting, because it was weaning, actually.
Okay.
Because I did wonder whether it would be 8 weeks, because 8-week weights are becoming, 8 weeks post lambing is becoming more of a subject that we're talking about and highlighting its importance, and we'll come on to that in a little bit. But yeah, weaning. So 99% of farmers that completed the survey said that BCS at mating was important for flock performance, and only 69% thought it was important at weaning. So I thought, oh right, well we need to put those two things together from the findings that we're finding at the moment. But actually, what I found really interesting as well was then we asked, and many of you, I hate saying farmers because you're all farmers listening, or most of you are, we asked you then how many of you did assess a condition. So we asked you if you thought it was important, and then later on we asked, did you do it? And it was interesting because even though 69% thought it was important at weaning, 92% of people did assess condition. So I thought that was quite interesting, although most of that was done visually, so done by eye rather than actually putting your hand on the back of the ewe, which, to be fair, for weaning coincides with shearing. You know, for 2 or 3 weeks after shearing, we can see the ewe better, body condition score wise, but once she's got sort of 3-4 weeks growth back on her, they tend to hide a multitude of sins, don't they?
Very much so.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of, you know, why we wanted to talk about this subject today, to sort of try and link those two things up together. So the next subject we will kind of just gradually move into really is about making that decision how and when to wean. We've emphasised, you know, why it's so important, and that it has a knock-on effect for at least 6 months, even up to a year. So that preliminary research that we did as well, looking at weaning weights of lambs next year, it actually highlighted that ewes that were really light and very low condition score at weaning, not only did they have fewer lambs the following year, but they also had lighter lambs as well if they did have multiples. So that's quite interesting, that it can be as long an impact as a year. So we were going to move on to lamb weights then. Hang on, let me phone. I forget we've got these slides to use as a bit of a guide. So they're the things that we're going to talk about today, which I think we're already on to. So we were going to just talk about weaning, weren't we, Matt? In terms of, at what age did you used to wean when you were at Diddling?
Well, when we first went there, we traditionally weaned at 16 weeks, but just before the project, we started weaning early. We started, well, earlier than 16 weeks. We started moving it down to 12, And the massive thing I found was that it made no a difference on the weight of the lambs. We were still weaning the same weight of lambs at 12 weeks as we was 16. So it becomes a competition effect that the lambs after that milk, the ewes trying to graze. There isn't a lot of milk there, and we can talk that through in this slide in a minute. But there's not enough milk there to do any good, and the ewes pinching all the good grass, and the lamb's not developing its rumen properly to continue grazing. And the biggest thing I remember when we weaned at 12 weeks was how quick the lambs settled down. You know, these lambs just literally got on with life. The stress and the noise upsetting the whole village really did not happen for days and days. They just literally got on with it. They got on with life.
So when you weaned them earlier, and we don't really mean early in terms of 8 weeks, but doing it up to at 12 weeks, they were less noisy than at 16.
Yeah, I remember as clear as day weaning some lambs at 12 weeks, weaning them in around lunchtime. Then I had Charlie Morgan, the grassland specialist on farm, and we went and see that group of grazed lambs about 10 o'clock in the morning. And I remember him saying that, oh, these have been weaned for a week. They'd been weaned less than 24 hours, and they were just all lay about grazing quite happily, quite content, getting on with life.
Okay, that's interesting. Because I think we both, before we compared what we wanted to include today, we'd both picked this graph, hadn't we? Which is quite spooky, but I think it's just about highlighting why we talk about weaning at 12 weeks. It's interesting in that survey as well, the majority of respondents were weaning later than 12 weeks. The average was 14, but we'll talk about averages in a bit and how that can be quite dangerous. We did have anything from 6 up to 24 weeks, so we did have a massive range there. But this slide really just highlights how over time the milk component of the diet does become less and less, and I think almost towards the end it almost becomes a bit of a habit, doesn't it? I think so it won't affect the lambs if you wean them at 12 weeks because they're already naturally weaning, and it doesn't go to 16 on here, but it would be negligible. So I think that's one of the things we wanted to talk about. If you're not already weaning at 12 weeks, then consider that as perhaps the new sort of date to aim for. But obviously that's something that varies year on year, doesn't it?
Yeah, I got to say that the 12 week thing, it was a bit scary doing it the first time, but we did a percentage of the farm. We did half and half and compared the difference and noticed there was no difference at all. And I think for anybody actually adopting something different, just try it on a group or try it on something and see how you get on. Don't go into it because we say it's right. We're convinced it's right, but it might not be right for you. So just do some, try, and we'd be interested in the feedback to see if you think it works as well as I do. Rest of the world, a lot of the other places, they all wean around this time. We're sometimes quite unusual that, especially, not having to go at AHDB, but the ram stuff, the 21 weeks, this, that, and the other, it's a bit late in my opinion.
Oh, you mean some of the scanning? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So just to talk a little bit then, if you we just talk about lamb weights and in terms of targets, Matt, shall I put it all on the screen and then we can talk through it? I'm just conscious I'm talking a lot, but that's nothing new, is it?
No, it's not at all. I'm not at all used to that one. No, I'm going to say we sat down. It was me. I think probably me and Leslie sat down with a pen and paper, and just when we were starting the project, just trying to work out where our targets wanted to be, and we decided that we were having this conversation the other day, Nerys. We don't know why we chose 8 weeks as such, but 8 weeks was chosen as a target. There would have been a reason behind it, but it was a long while ago. And 300 grams was decided was our target, and I believe that's well achievable on most farms, but it gave us a good target to start from and move from. Where are we, where we got, and it works out to being 300 grams a day. And I've seen all over Twitter and Facebook lately people showing that lambs are doing 400, 500 grams a day. They're easily possible. If all conditions are right, we can make these lambs do a lot more than 300 grams a day. But we chose 300 grams a day. we went to 8 weeks, and it doesn't mean that we were weighing every lamb spot on 8 weeks. No, we readjusted the figures back to the point of 8 weeks. So they might have been weighed on 9, they might have been weighed on 6, and we readjusted the figures according to the data. And we used it as a benchmark to see map improvement and map what was going on. So the 20 kilo mark was taken. You can see, I don't know what 2015 this is from, and average weight was 23.5, and it gave us a great place to work from and see where we were. And then we were also taking the body condition scores at the same point, and that was helping us give the assessment of when we were weaning, how thin were the ewes, and how many lambs were above the target. But also, what were we going to do with the lambs that didn't meet the target? And we used the project to try and work out why they didn't meet the target, and also what do we need to do to get them back on track? How was we going to do it? So we started playing around with some interventions, which was very interesting. Weaning some of these lambs at 8 weeks to see what happened, and we're putting them onto creep. Also seeing what other things affected them, which was a quite interesting thing to look at. Were there any?
Yeah, we've got a slide coming up on that in a bit, haven't we?
Yeah, we got a slide about that in a bit. And then we also looked at the next thing was the weaning thing. Once we weaned, how much have they changed that, and how much it had moved. And it was interesting over the time using the data of how, we haven't got it in this presentation, but how we moved the feet of what percentage of lambs got over the target. And it just focused your mind to where you wanted to be and what you were trying to achieve. And I think that's the key thing. It's just to focus what's going on and address the little issues that are going on. If these lambs are light, every farm has light lambs. How do we deal with them? If everything's ticking along brilliantly, we're gonna finish them. We know that, but we do know that if these lambs at 12 weeks, or were at diddling, if these lambs at 12 weeks weren't 30 kilos, or around the 27 to 30 kilos, we really struggled getting them finished and sold. And I used to have a KPI that I wanted the 80% of the lambs sold by the time the ewes went in with the rams again. And if they weren't around that weight, we just could not do it.
Okay, I'd just be interested to see, normally in a room full of farmers by now, I'm sure we'd be having a question about those targets of 20 kilos and 30 kilos. So if anybody has got any questions, please do type them in the chat, if nothing else, just to show us that you're listening. And it's just me and Matt speaking to each other. But yeah, we always get questions, don't we, about 20 kilos. Is it a flock average or is it an individual sort of target? And we both sort of talked yesterday and said we wanted to highlight how it's, look at that spread on that screen. An average can be dangerous. So the flock achieved the average as a whole of 20.3 in that year, but you'll see you've got some absolutely steaming ahead at over 30 kilos, but then obviously you've got some this end as well. So it was more of an individual lamb target rather than trying to get a flock average, and then the same up through with weaning as well. No questions coming through. That must mean everybody must agree with it. Oh yeah.
Well, they're starting to come.
Brilliant.
Oh, I don't know if you need my camera on, but anyways, here we go. Well, the first one, Nerys, I think, was on the KPI project. Where were the farms situated?
So we had one down in Sussex, one in Leicestershire, and one in Lancashire. They were all what I would call lowland flocks with lowland targets, all mating as shearlings, a mixture of buying in their own replacements and rearing, and indoor lambing. So there was a bias towards indoor lambing, but for the data that we collected, I don't see that that's a bad thing.
And they were mixed ages as well.
Yeah, I've got to say, it was all mixed ages, and it was also it was the first time this data was ever really pulled together. So indoor lambing just made it that if we've got a problem with capturing data or something, the sheep were there for an extra day. There wasn't wandering off and we had to catch them, But that's moved on now. There's enough people capturing data outside now.
So we do have a few questions, so I'll try and go through the few that's come in so far. Oh yeah, that's some of your, I suppose it's more on your own, on the flock that was at diddling. Were you drawing any lambs at 12 weeks? So some of those high achievers, were they?
Yep. Some of the singles, some years we were pulling them finished at 40 kilos, 41 kilos. You know, we were selling some. You can see that from the graph there. We got percentage there, you know, under 50 or so on that year that were there to be sold. Yeah, half of our breed line was maternal, so you know, the other half was a finishing line, and we were able to do it.
And then, and this is more of probably a management. With the 7-week lambing period, when does 8 weeks start from? The firstborn or the middle?
We weaned batches, so we would have 3 weaning points. We wouldn't wean all on one day. We would literally have 3 different points.
But it's more of when it's when you're lambing. So
yeah, normally what we say, if you want to sort of calculate it back and you haven't got date of birth, we say from the midpoint of lambing. That's normally what we say as a crude, because you'll always get 1 or 2 lamb early, and then you'll always get some dragging it out towards the end. So we normally say as a midpoint, if that's helpful.
And then I'll try and get through another 2, and they're all coming. We shouldn't encourage them so much, Nerys.
That's good. I like that. So, questions.
How heavy are your ewes? Would a 65 kilo ewe have this target? Have this as a target?
A lot of my ewes were that sort of weight. That wasn't an issue.
We answered that one, and then last one for now. The bell curve. So, oh god, it's all just jumped. Surprised how the bell-shaped curves. Would you expect to be a bit less of the left-hand tail? So I suppose the lighter side of it.
I think some of those under 10, we would have to look at whether they were still alive, because it could be a birth weight. Because if you look at sort of, this is raw management data. So yeah, probably on the left-hand side. If this was going into my PhD data, I'd have to tidy that up, because I don't think we could clearly say there was a 7 kilo lamb at 56 days. But
I can honestly say some lambs did come through around that 8 to 10 kilos, because I had an automatic drafter, and anything below 8 kilos doesn't trigger the gates. So I do know at 8 weeks there was the odd lamb that would not trigger the gates. So some of these lambs were still alive, but the ewe was definitely not looking after them. You know, so you know they'd got that far, but they were seriously stunted.
Okay, and it's interesting. We'll talk about those tail end ewes in lambs in a minute. We've got a whole bib on that.
So I suppose the last one, just because it's probably more reference to this slide, in terms of the targets, there was a suggestion that they seem a bit low. But did you consider stretching your targets to drive improved performance? So I know that the 300 was the average. Was that for your farm? That was kind of optimum, or?
Yeah. So at the beginning of the project, we set those targets almost as a, what do we think we could achieve on an individual level? Every year, as body condition score improved, those targets did increase. Over that time as well, I did get other people sending me data where I would look at those, and I've got some flocks that would be averaging 24 kilos at 8 weeks, who'd be, so, you know, that's normally the question we get is 20 kilos applicable to everybody? Well, for some, no, it isn't. You need to be stretching yourself. So when you get to 20 kilos, it's not a case of going, oh, we're there. It's actually right next year, it's 21. How do we get to there? So yeah, this was just drawing a line in the sand really for all 3 farms to monitor over the 3 years. But I'd absolutely encourage anybody, if you're already hitting 22, 23, don't bring your target down. It's just about how you keep that going or improving going forward. So yeah.
But again, this was the first time anybody had ever put a line in the sand to what we were trying to achieve. This had, you know, been done on the odd place, but you know, using Liz and Leslie, nobody had ever tried to do this and kept comparing 3 farms and having an idea of what 3 farms average might be.
And those averages you're looking at, are they for twins? So
no, everything.
Everything. So that you didn't set different targets for singles or twins as such.
No, in some respects, if a single's not hitting a 20 kilos, you need to be thinking why.
Yeah.
You know, they should be the first to be hitting those kilos.
But we've got to remember, every flock is a business. We've got to look at the whole business, the whole flock, what it's doing. Just looking at singles or twins, that's the next step that Nerys is very good at doing, breaking the data down. But for the average, for looking at what a business is doing, we need to look at the whole structure of every single lamb that's available.
I'll let you continue on to the next section, and we'll come back. We do have plenty of questions coming through, so we'll ask a few more in another few minutes.
Okay, and just to emphasize, if we don't answer your question today, we will be going through those unanswered questions and get back to you on an individual basis. Okay, so yeah, beware of averages. So this is Leslie's slide. Right, so below target lambs, do you want to talk a little bit about those, Matt? Because obviously somebody has already primed us with that question about the tail end lambs. Let me just, people might be distracted.
Yeah, I've just been informed by somebody who's watching us talk, Nerys, that them graphs are actually twins. So we were both
it is
wrong.
just the twins pulled out of there. Okay.
It is just the twins. I've just been informed. So yes.
Okay.
So that makes me feel better that, you know, they're doing better than we thought.
So if we talk about those tail end ewes then, lambs, Matt, in terms of, you've already touched on it briefly in terms of intervention and what you did, but if you just talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, no, I can't remember when it was. I can't remember. It was about halfway through the project.
Yeah.
You know, the second year of the project, we decided that now we know where the average is. If the lambs are not hitting it, and how far below it do we make the decision? And we made the decision. In reality, it was probably in real time. It's probably around the 16, 17 kilos. If the lambs hadn't hit that, what are we going to do about them? So we looked at doing some intervention, and what we did the first year is like everything we seem to do at diddling, is we seem to take a percentage of them, half of them, and leave half on the ewes and take the other half and do something else with them and see what happened. And for me, it was very interesting shedding them off. We bring most of, when we started doing all this project, we kind of started bringing more and more sheep back to the buildings and handle them in the buildings, just for space, for drafting. And for me, it made life easier. If I'd forgot something, it was easier to get hold of than driving halfway around the farm to find it. But shedding the lambs off, the light lambs, the lambs that were doing all right, you know, then what we did was we literally put a gate through the middle of them and put half of them back out in the field, recorded their EIDs and said they've gone back out with the ewes, and put the other half into a small paddock, and we trained them to creep. So I put troughs out to start with, and I also found a couple of ewes that weren't milking at all, probably had mastitis or something, just to put in with them, because something I'm more aware of is when we're weaning, we need to understand the social aspect of that. These lambs need to settle down where they've come from, so they know where water is, they know where their grazing is. So planning ahead, so when we're weaning, that we know how we're going to do it, that we're just not going to chuck those lambs in that field and they've got to find the water and find the boundaries. No, when I was weaning, we weaned so they knew they were going back to where they come from, and we took the ewes away. So this was kind of breaking that rule. So I just chucked a couple of cool ewes in, but it also gave them the opportunity to train the lambs to come to the trough. And after a few days, the lambs were coming up to the trough, and we monitored the difference between those lambs and the other lambs to see what the effects were, and did it have a cost effect. And we did notice that the lambs, once they got hold of the creep, no shock to anybody, they started transform and started to grow on. Some didn't, but some majority did. But the lambs that stay on the ewes still stayed where they were. So having that advantage that they're already behind, they're already small, let's do something about it to try and help the bottom line. Not decide in January or February that actually they're still small, so we'll just sell them as light lambs. Let's try and do something early. But then we tried to work out, I can't remember if it was in the third year or was in that year, that why they're light.
Yeah.
Is there something that's happened to them in their life? The obvious thing is the mastitis, and a percentage of them came from that. But what else in things? And this is where we were set to the challenge by Nerys and probably Leslie at the same point to actually try and work out what was going on. And for me, this was quite interesting, and it was a lot easier to record than what I thought. So like any lamb that had watery mouth, we just put a red insulation tape. Lambing time, I love insulation tape. I just wrap it around the bar on the pen to tell me what's going on. My writing is not the best, as Nerys will tell you, with dyslexia. You know, we have some great laugh with the vet students working out what I've written down in notebooks. So we just use coloured tapes to indicate what's going on. And somebody wandered down with a scanner twice a day and just scanned every single ewe, because the lambs weren't tagged at the time, that had watery mouth. So we could look at their offspring to work out what's going on. And we also did the same with milk replacers to work out if these lambs had not had their colostrum, but had something after they should have had their colostrum. So had they had a milk replacer or something because the ewe wasn't milking properly, and what effect that had. Bad mothers were the mothers. We all put these lambs back together out in the field that's wandered off too far. We class that as a bad mother. Also, adoptions came under that category as well. Did we have a lamb added on? Mastitis, and then the one I wanted to look at was what effect interned eyelids had. And I got quite a shock that how the effect wasn't as bad as I thought. Now, is that down to we've got a management right, or, you know, that's how you've got to look at some of this information. Are you doing your job right? And you can get rid of the effects to a certain degree. But it was very interesting.
They always look so miserable with entropion, don't they? They just, you always think, would it affect performance? But I think we were quite surprised. So just to very quickly explain this table, you've got the cause that we looked for, and then you've got all of the lambs that out of the 1,300 odd that were on the flock that year, how many of them had watery mouth or had any colostrum replacer. And then in the brackets, that's a percentage of the flock as a whole. And then in the next column, it's how many light lambs we had, and then it's how many of those then had that diagnosis, and then what the percentage was, just to try and look as a percentage what the difference was. Sorry, Matt, I just wanted to go through that one. But it's not as, so it's interesting how the 82 of the whole flock that had entropion, only 8 of them actually were light.
Yeah, so, and I think for me that was a, I won't say a eureka moment, but it wasn't what I would sit there on a piece of paper, a bit like your question earlier about when would your body condition score. I would put some of these figures in the opposite way around. You know, I just so shocked that, you know, that it wasn't the effect that we might say it was, but that's the advantage of correcting information. You can disprove or prove your theories. Yeah,
exactly. But I think what the standout one for us for that one was there weren't many cases of mastitis, clinical cases that we were able to log. I say I didn't do any of those. I just do the number crunching from my office. Every single one of those lambs were in the light lambs category. And every time we say that, you kind of, you know, everyone goes, yeah, that makes sense. But we've never been able to prove that before, that is the knock-on effect of having mastitis. All of those lambs were light at the end. It's probably worth sort of saying that the percentage of light lambs did change over the year, and depending on flock as well. So we don't really know nationally what a target of that would be, but we didn't really get much below 10% throughout the 3 years on the 3 farms. Some years where the flock average weights were lower, we would get maybe up to 30% of those lambs were light. So that's why we were wanting to look at, it wasn't just body condition score and weight, because even though body condition score was improving on these farms, we were still having a percentage of light lambs. So it was trying to sort of pin down what those were. So yeah, I think in terms of weaning, like you say, Matt, it's utilising that 8-week weight of lambs, but also of ewes to determine what are we going to do this year with our lambs.
Yeah, and that's it. That's the crux of it. Is, you know, especially if you've got some information or some targets. you know, how thin are they? What's the priority and what's the driver for next year? As we know through your research that actually weaning at 12 weeks, that body condition score and weight to get back is difficult. It's very difficult. You know, if they're too thin, and we know what effect that has now on the scanning results next year. So, which I wasn't very good at when this project started, was planning 6 months ahead, you know, but that's really where we need to start looking now.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just trying to remember what my next graph is. I'm just trying to balance that sort of us having a chat with people and what time it is. Right. Okay, we're on track. And I just realized somebody just messaged me saying your video's off, which I hadn't realized. No harm done, but I have just put the video back on. So when we were chatting over the last couple of days, we were talking about would worm control come up with the questions and the effect that worm control had on the farms. Now, we don't have time to do a full-on worm chat. And if any of you know me well, you know you won't get away with less than an hour of worm chat from me, but I don't think we can not touch on the subject. So Matt, just to sort of tell us a bit, what did you do? What did all the farms on the KPI project do in terms of worm control? Oh, actually, sorry, before I say that, I have to say the one thing we've forgotten to say about light lambs, Matt, age.
Ah, yes.
We forgot to talk about that. Because that actually bore a whole new project called Challenge Sheep. But just very, very quickly, all of the sheep on this farm, on the 3 farms, were tupped to lamb as shearlings. No ewe lambs were mated at 2 of the 3 farms. There was a small ewe lamb flock on 1 of them, but that wasn't analysed because it was such a small data set. And we looked at all sorts of things, but one of the really significant things that came out was the shearling ewes, that they had the biggest contribution to light lambs as well, didn't they, Matt? Can't believe we nearly forgot to talk about that, because that actually, you know, produced Challenge Sheep, which is another massive project.
Yeah, again, I think it wasn't revolutionary to us. We might have guessed it, but actually having the proof that that was what it was, and going to be able to go to AHDB to go, this needs to be looked into, was a great step forward, because if we hadn't have done this, we wouldn't have even been looking at it.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that was highlighted was the importance of looking after shearlings, especially those that are rearing twins. So, but Challenge Sheep is a whole other table talk, isn't it? But I just thought we have to mention that before we move on, because it sprung in my mind.
Do you want
so, yeah,
Sorry, do you want a few quick questions before we move on to the next bit?
Yeah, that's fine.
Just because there's loads coming in, which is good.
That is good.
I'm going to use the questionnaire prerogative and not even pretend to pronounce this word, but the interned eyelids, how were they treated?
I injected them out with liquid paraffin. So fold it down and inject like a subcut injection and put in some medical grade liquid paraffin.
That's just to sort of pull it out, isn't it? Because
to hold it down.
So that's another option.
Yeah.
And then you kind of already answered. There was a question about what type you use and
yes, I saw that, which is why I was like, I'll try and answer kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
So that has been answered. There was more about the lambs themselves in terms of the growth rates after weaning and monitoring them through. So was their growth rates vary over the life of those lambs, I suppose.
So for me at weaning, the project ended, but we do have that data. So we do have the finish date of all of those lambs. And I don't know if you want to answer that question, Matt, because you're probably more qualified to answer it than me, but there was a spread, wasn't there?
There was a massive spread. But yeah, the lambs were weighed every time they came in the handling system. So weights were captured, data was captured. There's a lot more data than Nerys has got in her project, because we could have drowned her with weight data and some extra body condition scoring points. yeah, everything was weighed, captured, monitored, and there's a lot more data hidden that Nerys has never seen.
Yeah, and I think it's important because once, obviously, beyond weaning, we've got other things that come into play, don't we? Worms, racks up a notch, which we're just about to come into. But yeah, we are, from our perspective, the minute the ewe was taken from the lamb, that's when we stopped looking, because you've got to draw a line in the sand somewhere. But there was a definite correlation though with 8-week weight affected weaning weight, which affected finishing weight and finishing date. And there's another PhD actually looking at that with Andy Jones over in Rothamsted, if anyone's interested.
So then we have another just around if you're splitting the weaning dates, how often would you be weaning? Is it once per week or every other week? How did you?
It depends on how quick we lambed. We could lamb 90% of them in about 2 weeks. So in the first cycle, we get 90% lambed. So we'd normally have 3 weaning dates. So the first week, the second week around then we'd probably miss a week to wean the later ones, and like the third week of lambing, always one batch slightly later.
And then we have one kind of in response to the gimmers. Is there any evidence from studies that gimmers would produce less like lambs if they've been mated as hogs?
Well, that is what Challenge Sheep is hoping to answer. So ask me in 2024.
So that's a
about probably when I get this PhD finished. No, I'm joking.
That is a watch this space answer.
Yeah. But it's interesting. Sorry, you go, Matt.
Well, the interesting thing was what we started to look at before Challenge Sheep started was again, from your interrogation of data, we started looking at shearlings, and we started looking at their growth patterns and what's happening as dry ewe lambs. And we started to be able to see, not interrogated to the tens that Nerys has done the KPI project data, but we could see an effect early on if the ewes were had not hit their target weights by the scanning the year before they went to the ram. So the January before they went to the ram in October, November, there was an effect on their litter size. So something that's majorly come out and hopefully be replicated and evidence shown in Challenge Sheep is that looking after these dry sheep. So we're at a dry point now. We're trying to look after ewes and lambs, but if you've got any replacements on your farm or you're growing on replacements, looking after those sheep and getting them to hit the targets as well is critically important for the year after.
I'll ask 2 and I'll try and make them 1. There is actually a question on about when to wean and shorter grass, but I think we might save that to a little bit later. But just on kind of light lambs or when to sell lambs. So one was, I'll read the 2 of them together. So would you have keep any data on the marketing in February when maybe the prices are better versus keeping them shorter when the prices mightn't be as high? And then another question on a similar side is light lambs being sold in January, February make more, taking into account creeping late, than lambs sold sooner as stores, but possibly being crept fed sooner, if that makes sense. How do you decide which is the best way to go? Which is more cost effective, early creeping or weaning later?
I like how Nerys leans back then.
No, not lean back as in, yeah. I mean, it's a question we often get, and we talked about this, didn't we, in terms of there are a number of things to consider. So, well, I don't know, Matt, do you want to say something, or am I just taking over? Sorry.
Well, no, but there's a lot of things taken into effect. How many of them lambs don't make it? But again, we're looking at next year's crop. So the big thing for me is, have you got enough feed to drive your ewes, get them back into condition and look after them for next year, especially in this sort of dry time? But I have made some serious good money putting them into a store market in August, and they've gone off the farm. Haven't got to worry about them. Each farm's an individual, but you've really got to sit down. Some of these light lambs are under 20 kilos. You can get some good money for them.
Yeah, I think it's about, when we were discussing, it's 2 things to consider. Is if you're going to be creeping them in January, February, your feed conversion ratio is probably going to be about 12 to 1. Whereas if you're creeping them much younger, you're looking at maybe 4 to 1. So that's one cost implication you need to consider. Another thing to consider is getting them to January and February. If you've got loads and loads of grass and your ewes aren't competing with the lambs, then it's less of an issue. But if you're in a part of the country where you always struggle to carry over through the winter, then I think that's something that you need to consider as well. And I always try to make the point as well is we always remember the batch of 50 that went for £130 in February, but we actually need to remember across the whole year, what does that look like? And I think as long as those lambs are there in January and February, and you've kind of planned it to a degree, and you don't accidentally get there, and then every year you find you've got more and more and more, and you don't know why, then that's something that needs to be considered as well. So a bit of a politician's answer. There isn't really an answer there.
I think the big thing is having less of them at 8 weeks. That's what we were trying to drive for. And if we'd got them, how were we going to deal with them and get out of them? And every farm's different, but for us, it was get out of them as quick as possible. Let's get that food conversion rate thing and look after the ewes, because they eat a lot of grass, them little lambs. If you start looking at it, working out how much they eat and how long they're there for, and start adding that up as pence per kilo of dry matter, they eat a lot of grass.
Cool. I think that's it for now, so I'll hand it.
Yeah, okay, great. So Matt, just say a little bit about obviously as the lambs are starting to graze, there is that impact of picking up larvae, looking at worm burdens. So it's that time of year where we're looking at that. So can you just say a bit about how we dealt with that in the KPI project, please?
We were lucky enough to be able to get the FETPAC system from Techion, I think that's how you say it, Techion, yeah. And we were monitoring fecal egg counts through the season using their system, getting the results back, well, within 2 hours most of the time. These days it's about 20 minutes, I think. But we were monitoring groups a lot more regular than what most farms would be. We could be running up to 60, 70 samples a year. I think the average for most farms is about 10. So we were taking a lot more samples, understanding a lot more what was going on, and targeting when the lambs actually needed it. Again, like a lot of the stuff which came through education and knowledge, is planning ahead. Taking fecal egg counts, seeing if the worms were there, started to map the fields to where high challenges were, and then trying to avoid weaning onto high challenge areas. A lot of it, most farmers know in the back of their mind. They know where lambs don't do. They know where they've got a problem, but they don't understand it. We were still learning at the end, but we started to learn massively quickly of where and why there was risks on certain places, and started to avoid it, and it made a massive difference.
Yeah. And so I think this year we didn't really get any extreme. I'm just trying to think. We didn't get any extreme years for worm control in that year, did we? But this year's been a bit of an unusual one in the fact that it's been so dry. We've seen, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's been some high counts out there, but generally I feel there's been some lower counts out there. We've now had some rain. So just for those, once the eggs are passed in the feces, it kind of sits there and waits to become larvae, and it needs a little bit of moisture. So now that we've had some rain, we really do need to be keeping an eye on the egg counts in these lambs. So even if you did one last week and it was very, very low, do look again in another sort of 10, 14 days just to see what's going to be happening inside that lamb. But I think it's quite an important topic, and there was a Scops sort of press release that came out about it yesterday, which again is very timely, just to talk about thinking about worm control and pasture contamination and where you're going to put those lambs, particularly if you're weaning perhaps that little bit earlier. Now, we're not talking about weaning at 8 or 10 weeks here, we're talking about weaning at 12, but the message is still the same. Try and identify which of your pastures are the dirtier or the most contaminated pastures, and try and put your weaned lambs onto those once they've settled down. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything else to that, Matt, but it was just something that's quite timely. It'd be awful to wean them, do it for the right reason, and then they get hit with a stonking EPG in a few weeks' time that's just going to knock them back.
Yeah, it's, the grass is short, the grazing slightly lower than what we used to. As soon as these eggs hatch, they haven't got to go far to climb up the grass, and the lambs will be eating them. it's down to like I said 2 or 3 times, is understanding what limitations you got, planning it out, and risk management. We don't do enough of it. I'm really started to learn in the last 5 years. Knowing where the risks are, and I won't say trying to avoid them, but using them to your strengths. It might be grazing the high contaminated pastures with your ewes to start with, to try and pick them up, use them a bit like hoovers. Dry ewe lambs. That we've got other management tools to use. So just start planning ahead, work out where the risks are, and try and manage around it.
Yeah, and silage. If we've been lucky enough to take any silage yet, silage aftermaths and that sort of thing as well, isn't it?
Yeah. But the big thing is just, if we're weaning onto silage aftermath, just put the ewes on it for a day or two, just to get them socially, so the lambs know where they are. So if we're having to wean onto them, they've already on there. We're not contaminating a reasonably clean ground with infected worms. Worm and move was something I was taught at college. It's something that is, I won't say frowned upon, but it's probably the best word I can think of without getting told off.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry, I've just pressed something on my control panel and everything's just completely moved. Yeah, okay, so shall we move on now to talk a little bit more then about where we are in terms of weaning, in terms of feed budgeting, and if we haven't got any grass, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
We can't just cross our fingers and hope it comes. But it started raining now, and I keep saying to everybody, once it starts, it probably won't stop, and the combines won't roll, and it's sod's law, isn't it?
I've got to say, most of the rain's been going round us. We've had one shower, and we've had 4 mil in it, but you wouldn't know it's hit the grass at all. The ground at all. It's so dry. It is unbelievably dry out there. But yeah, we need to be starting to plan ahead. I know farmers don't like measuring grass. But
some do. Some do.
Well, yeah, the majority of the industry don't. But we've got to look at our bank balance, and we really do need to think about the grass, especially on a year like this, how much grass is available and how much predicted forwards there's going to be. I've been lucky to use programs like Farmax that can forecast ahead, but you can do it in Excel, you can do it on a bit of paper. Just simply do a budget to work out how long they're going to last in the field, or how much the whole farm's going to need. And we can see from the Farmax graphs that's there, grass has dropped off. Nobody's shocked. March time, May time, some farmers been at hold it. June, it's massively dropping off. But looking at the forecast ahead for this farm, it's there is not enough grass to. Well, there's enough grass to drive the business, but not enough. The impact's there all the way through to topping. So the pasture cover graph, the green line or wide green band that goes through the middle of it, is your target of where we want things to work, and that's where the engine works lovely. If it gets too high above it, we're getting too much stem, we're losing the quality of the grass, which lowers the lowers the fuel quality on the farm. Getting below it, the problem is the recovery rate's slow, and that's the biggest worry we've got this year, is the recovery rate is slow, because we've got a lot of the bottom leaves off, the index is short, and it just can't. The solar panels, for the best word I heard the other night, and I thought it's about right, the solar panels are not there to absorb the light properly, so the grass is going to be stunted. So we've had a bit of rain, but it's going to take it a week, probably more like 3 weeks, to recover and start growing back. But them ewes and lambs are going to be nibbling that off. So again, we need to start planning. For me, measuring grass, I could do it on a weekly basis, but for a lot of farms, just a monthly measure of grass. Get hold of your local AHDB rep. They'll soon post you some sward sticks out. They're free. Have as many as you want. There's a manual to probably go with it to give you some ideas of how to work the calculations out. But start planning ahead and budgeting to what we need, because we know these animals need a lot of food to drive them. And the biggest thing that me and one of the other farms discovered, a thin ewe actually eats a lot more grass than a fat ewe. So if they use a thin, they'll actually eat a damn sight more, and it is a shock to how much more they actually do eat. If we haven't got enough grass, if we haven't made our silage, we've got to start planning ways around it. A lot of farms haven't got enough winter reserves in place, and we've got to start planning ahead and making the decisions early. And it's making decisions early as to what is the priority. Is the priority to finish your lambs in February, sell them as stalls, get the ewes back into body condition score, or make winter silage? Making the decisions early is the best decision you can make.
I think when you do it earlier as well, you've almost got more options.
Yeah, and
you?
if you plan like I used to do a lot of the time for the worst case scenario, then we got rain and everything went right, you can deal with that. But you can't deal if you plan for the best case scenario and it goes wrong.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's plan ahead and work out how to fill the gap. Stubble turnips are available. Stubble turnips are an option for winter, but there's 90 days before we get there, and we might have to get the ewes back. Need more energy to get the ewes back into condition. So we need to start planning. And if it keeps dry, will we get this winter forage in the ground and be able to get it to grow? There's a lot of ifs and buts, but this is becoming more of the norm. We're seeing more of the norm of dry times, especially in the spring, early summer. This is the second year out of 3.
Yeah, and definitely down here in the south, aren't we? Yeah.
Yeah, and we're seeing wet winters now, more and more wet winters, which is making it more and more difficult. So it's finding out what your pinch point is and sitting down, having conversations with other people and trying to work out what's available in your local area and working out how you're going to fill the gap.
Yeah. Okay. And we've already touched on some of those, haven't we, in terms of lightening the load on the farm. So things like selling your cull ewes. But I know, you'll always get someone who goes, yeah, but, if everyone sells them at the same time, price is going to fall. And yes, that does happen. But then if you make your decision to sell yours before everybody else does, you will get in there before the price does drop. So.
Yeah, and if you flick it onto the next slide, hopefully you've got it in the next slide of how much dry matter some of these ewes needed at diddling.
I have. Oh God, that's doing something very fancy. Wasn't expecting that.
Nor was I. This is something again that came out of the project, and Leslie sat down one day, and I don't know if you were involved, Nerys, but sat down and worked out how much energy and converted it back to kilos of dry matter. So how much energy and how much food these sheep need to get back into condition and hold their condition. And it was scary when we look at the totals of needing 102,000 kilos of dry matter. If that was bags of cake sat on a farm, every farmer would have a apoplectic nightmare of how much that's cost.
Yeah, that would be a fortune.
Yeah, it'd be an absolute fortune. Grass is cheap. We all keep on about it. Grass is cheap. But if we haven't got it, how are we going to get it back? And the cost effect of getting it back this year hits on the cost effect to next year. Do we want to limit the effects into 1 year as much as we can? So working it out, trying to plan ahead is keep on about it. It's just what we need to do as an industry. This figure scared me.
It's so hard, and I can see why it's hard, because you're technically, if you want to think of it really brutally, you're writing a check now to save money next year, but you're not going to necessarily see that income coming in an extra check. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
You're going to feel like you're spending out now, and you will reap the benefits, but it will be harder to see that, if that makes sense. So it's a shame you didn't get an actual separate check for what the difference is if you had done that extra feeding to get them into condition.
Well, that's one of the things, that with Farmax, and not trying to sell it at all, but with Farmax is you can run a 2-year scenario. We can, you can see what effects had in this year. You can turn it to a gross margin and run it over a 2-year period. So see how much food you need, what effects are if we add something in, if we sell sheep early, running all them scenarios to work out what the effect is in this year, but then extend it out into next year, actually opens your mind to different possibilities of what's available and what that cost impact might be. Because we're all good at knowing what our costs are, but seeing it over 2 production cycles is very unusual to see.
Yeah. Okay. So Joseph, I don't know if there's any questions coming in.
Yes, we have just a few questions kind of around that. So I suppose we were throwing out some options, but one of them was, right, you know, this is from a hill farm, you know, they're short of grass. When do you, what do you wean on to? So, you know, silage hasn't been cut, things are behind. I think you started touching on, I know it's very hard to give definitive answers because obviously every farm is different, but you mentioned something there about you maybe selling some cull ewes. I suppose for my kind of thing is, what do you prioritize? Are you prioritizing, if it gets really bad, are you prioritizing your ewes for next year or your lambs for this year?
Yeah, and I think that's what we've not maybe directly actually said the words, isn't it, Matt? That's a decision you have to make. At what point are you deciding, right, my focus is now going to be the ewe, and then my lambs are going to be this is what I'm going to do with them, not your plan B, but at what point do you decide my ewes are now my focus? I think sometimes there are examples where we over focus on getting those lambs finished and finishing everything on the farm, and we've actually then sacrificed the ewes and the next production year. So I think that's what we've inadvertently, maybe not directly and obviously said. So you need to take a point and decide for your farm and your circumstances, at what point do you make that decision that your ewe is actually more important now, and then you work out what to do with those lambs.
Yeah, that's what we need to do, is just work out what's your priorities. For me, most of the time, I want that impact to be in 1 year. I don't want to spread the impact over 2. Make the decision that the ewes are going to be the driver. Wean the lambs, get the lambs settled as early as you can, so 12 weeks. Get them weaned, get the lambs settled. Then they can be held as stores. They're the ones that can be held onto the lower quality grass, but they're the ones held. You've made the decision. They're potentially going to go as stores, and give somebody else who can deal with that, and get the ewes and get your winter silage made.
And we haven't really touched on it much, but it's also trying to make sure that your ewe lambs, or depending what part of the country you're in, your hogs, that they aren't sacrificed this year as well. That, you know, if you do make ewe lambs, make sure they hit that. You know, we say 60% of mature body weight, but there's more research coming out of New Zealand now suggesting that the heavier ewe lambs are, there's very few disadvantages if you are hitting 40, 42 kilos. So it's maybe you need to prioritize your replacements, prioritize those that are almost finished, and then look at your subgroup then and prioritize them as your stores, or the ones that you keep through to February on different grazing.
But
so I don't know if that's that hill farmer's question though, sorry, in terms of what do you wean to?
Yeah, so that's what they have a bit of a challenge of where do they, well, I suppose from what I gather from the question is, there's a challenge of the system obviously can't take everything at the moment because nothing's growing, so it's making those tough decisions of what to prioritize.
Which is very hard for us sat a long way away to actually give a clear decision. But the clear decision is you've got to look what's around you. Silage, buying any winter foraging is going to be expensive because the whole country's in a drought. You know, even straw and that, like down here with us where we are in the south, straw's going to be short. So decisions need to be looked at and made decisions, you know, ahead of time.
So just on the graph you're showing, is that for they're asking about the period of time? So is that showing total demand for a whole year, or? No,
that's showing. Go on, Nerys.
No, you go. It's your graph. I need to stop talking.
That was just for a period. That was just for a period of time. That was after weaning. That was from August to tupping, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, that was all you need. That was what you needed just to get them back into condition for tupping. So
yeah,
it's much more than that during the year. Although to be fair, that's when they're going to need to gain the most weight. But it's just highlighting if you've got fewer of them below 2.5, then you've got less of that condition to put on. And we always say, you know, it takes 6 to 8 weeks to put a unit of condition score on good grass. So it will take that time.
I got a question for you, Nerys, and this will bring a smile to your face.
In a good way?
Well, depending on the weather, what age should you start fecal egg counting testing on that?
Okay. Yeah. So, well, when Matt sat his rammer exam, he'll be able to answer that. But for me, now it's me. So we normally say, I don't know if anyone watched Leslie's webinar on worm control. So once lambs are grazing, and they do start grazing much younger than we think, so you could start seeing them nibbling from about 2 to 3 weeks of age. It then takes 3 weeks for whatever they eat to turn into an egg. So you're looking at around 5-6 weeks of age for a fecal egg count to be taken. You can do them a bit sooner and look for nematodirus and cocci and things like that, but you need to just take them with a pinch of salt, because the damage from nematodirus is done from the larvae, not the eggs. So for your round stomach worms, I'd say 5-6 weeks of age.
And then, so we're getting through them. Going back to the study then, did you see any link between light lambs, or between lamb weight and mortality?
Yeah, so we didn't touch on that, but when Matt did the intervention, and half of the light lambs were kept with the mothers and half of them were creep fed, out of those that kept with them, stayed with the mothers, more of them died and they took longer to finish. So mortality did decrease. So mortality generally increased in the lighter lambs, but it did decrease when we intervened and put them onto creep. So that was quite interesting as well.
Yeah.
And then one is, how long do you keep the ewes on tight grass at weaning? Matt.
Right, yeah. So from a milk production perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah. Matt, what did you usually do?
Well, sorry to say, but we used to house, we got through the project, we started housing ewes to wean them quicker and harder, so we got more opportunity of getting the condition back on them. But we used to, the ewes that used to stay out before we started doing that, we used to graze them, the fields down really, really tight. And it used to take us about 10 days before we could get them back in and start going through them and looking at the rudders. So it used to take us about 10 days on very limited short grass to get their rudders down and get them back under control so we could examine them.
Yeah, okay.
And then one, I'm conscious of the time, so we'll try and get through them. If a thin ewe eats more grass, I suppose, then using the kg dry matter, grass required as a percentage of body weight, does that still work? If that makes sense.
Yeah, you just change your conversion rate. So instead of working at 2.5% of body weight, you have to lift it up to nearer 4. So 4% of its body weight for thin ewes, and as they get nearer the target, it's more like 2.2.
Okay.
So I just think of it, if I imagine if I'd ever run a marathon, I'd probably eat loads afterwards because I'd be really, really hungry. So I think of the analogy like that. Not that I've ever have or ever will run a marathon.
I'm just going to move on from that one. And then the next one, do you measure ewe mortality? And then do you still sell most of your lamb, or did you sell most of your lambs at stores?
Depends on the year. We made the decision of how much grass we needed, how much grass was available. We went from selling, I can't remember without looking at the presentations, but I think we went from selling 30% of stores to when we finished selling none of stores. So we slowly shifted over the time of the project, selling less and less stores. But the big driver was how much grass do we need to get the ewes back into condition? What surplus have we got? Then we made the decisions.
And this one is kind of for you, well, Matt. So is there any cost benefit analysis for data collection? So in terms of the cost, the labor, the equipment versus the financial benefit? So I think that is a challenge for a lot of farmers, is you can collect a lot of data, but it's a lot of work too. And where do you,
Yeah, I don't think everybody's done a proper cost benefit of it through like a PhD or anything like that, what I know of. But with running a farm, I do know that actually it took us 3 years to actually get some information that was worthwhile, that was bulletproof, to get some of the wrinkles out of the system, not just collecting the data, but get some of the dry conditions, wet conditions. So we got an average that was actually worthwhile, so we could make decisions on. But over the time, we improved the gross margin and return on profit to the owner of Diddling Farms massively. So it took us 10 years to do it, but the last year when we sold the business up, the profit was really impressive.
I think it's the sort of thing you need to think about. What are you going to use that information for? Because I'm not against people gathering data. I'm all for it. But if you're not going to use that data, I think that's where that cost benefit is going to decrease. So I think if you're collecting all of this data, and like we at the start of the project couldn't get it out, we were like, how do we get this back out again? How do we work out our 8-week weight average? How do we work out our weaning, and how do we look at the differences? So I'd almost say, you know, if you're collecting a lot of data and doing nothing with it, maybe take a step back, collect a little bit less, but do something with it. And I think that's where your cost benefit will improve.
Yeah, I agree with that. But when we started to home down, some of the graphs that I produced in 2007-8 are wonderful, but they actually meant nothing when we came down to it. But now knowing what the KPIs are and what's driving it, to use that ahead of game, like taking your weaning data, looking at what size did you well, and looking at where you need to invest money for next year, instead of looking at when did I sell the lambs in November and I've already bought my rams. It changes the ballpark of how you look at your business and where you invest money.
So the last one or two for now. We do have some other questions that we may try and pick up afterwards. I'm sorry if you haven't got to them. We have a few comments of people declaring their love for measuring grass, which is nice to see.
Yeah, I knew there'd be some out there.
So one of the comments was kind of, they started measuring last year. Now they're doing it weekly, and it's been a game changer through the drought, as it's helped create so many more options in dealing with the challenges. And also another comment looking at a study that was Beef and Lamb New Zealand around lamb mortality from ewes with other defects. And it's something like
there's a podcast on there, isn't that? I think
yeah,
it's quite a good podcast if anyone wants to. I mean, our podcasts are great, but Beef and Lamb New Zealand have got some good ones as well. So,
so yes, it was highlighting that podcast.
All right, okay.
To show
you just need to learn their terminology. Me and Nerys have had quite a few giggles of actually working out what some of the words mean they use.
I can't comment with my accent.
It's just about being well, it happens in Wales. So.
And I think that's that's most of it for now. I'm conscious of one or two slides and time, so I'll let you.
No, that's fine. You'll probably get the gist, people listening, that I can talk forever, but me and Matt can talk together forever as well. So just finishing off with some take-home messages then. It's a really difficult one because we can't tell you all, do this at this date and this will happen, because it's very farm specific. So if you've got any inquiries, please do send them over. But the key messages are that UBCS at weaning will impact litter size next year. So there really is a long-term effect. So let's try and think of trying to reduce an impact of a difficult year and it not knocking on next year, and use that sort of lamb and ewe performance to determine weaning, and let's try and get it nearer to the 12-week mark. Look at identifying your light lambs. We're probably a bit further ahead than 8 weeks now. Consider the effect of worms at weaning. The Scops alert on some considerations for that larvae is available as well. And then look at what your feed options are, assess what your livestock is, and like we said, make your priorities. What is your priority, and then look to fill those gaps. And as we said already, earlier the better, more options available. And I sort of put, don't be afraid to do something different. So if you've never sold a store lamb before, it's not a failure for lambs to leave a farm as a store. You know, if that's a decision that you make, or for your cull ewes to go a bit sooner, then it's just changing with the season. And then resources, then a link for most of these will come out onto the email at the end that's sent round to everybody who registered. So we've got the managing ewes, ewe nutrition and worm control. All our meetings, well, they're not really meetings now, they're online meetings. Hopefully we will get to come out on farm at some point in the foreseeable future. And I wanted to add as well, so they're all on our website, but I also wanted to say, some of you may have learned about this meeting via Twitter or Facebook and you don't actually hear from us. So if we don't know who you are, we don't contact you. So if you don't hear from us, please go onto our website and fill in our keep in touch form. because if we, we don't automatically get a list of who our levy payers are, and some of you may hear nothing from us and therefore think, what do we do? But it's because we don't have your email address or your address to send you anything. So please do go onto that. And yeah, just thank you for listening. Thank you to Matt for putting up with my data requests over the years, and for doing today's talk. There are Twitter handles if anybody wants to get in touch via social media, or there's our email addresses as well. Mine's on the AHDB website. So yeah, thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Nerys.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. So there will be a link that is sent immediately now as this ends if you want to provide feedback on today, but then another email will be sent afterwards with a recording of today's meeting, and then the links will be there as well. So yeah, that's all from us too. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you all. I'll end the meeting, and I'll just say this is the last thing. The next event is next week. It's with two of our strategic farmers, and they will be talking about what's happened on their farms, but also some of their experiences with direct selling, which you may find interesting as well. So yeah, just go on the website and book on. So thank you all, and I'll thank you for joining.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.